the final presenter, Professor Andreas Holtermann, if I pronounce it correctly. I just learned, did you invented the physical activity paradox phrase?
While it's, I think it's the first time it was mentioned as a paradox. It's from the Oslo study cohort from the, was it 80 something? So almost before I was born. Paradox was mentioned. So I partly stole it from calling it this physical activity paradox. It needs to be some kind of key to get some attention.
Okay. You're one of the front runners in the field. So I'm looking very forward to your talk, what we should do in the upcoming years. And the floor is yours. And looking forward to learn.
Yeah.
And maybe, yeah.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks for this wonderful initiative. I think it's really great to have these type of global possibilities to discuss physical activity. And I think particularly I really like these presentations up to now, covering all the different types of disciplines of physical activity, like rehabilitation and operation settings, occupational and work activity setting. And I will discuss a bit about why I think it's important to cross borders between disciplines of called disciplines of physical activity, which is mainly about public health and their view on physical activity, occupational health and view on physical activity. But I'll also catch up on sports medicine and physical activity, which I know the least of. So I hope you can help me out there with respect to the questions. I'll try as much as possible with a smile. So just to get your thinking as much as possible. And I'll just up on what was mentioned in one of the questions. It was about health literacy. And I thought a lot about we should invent a physical activity literacy. How would that look like across different disciplines? So let's say that a person, an adult person, 50 years of age, how do you think that we will try to educate this person to be literate about physical activity when it's about leisure time, when it's about how to behave at work, and with respect to if you get some kind of injury or some health issues which you need to improve upon? I think it's a big problem today that what we see at workplaces is that if you have a worker, the work is often told by or the health authority or just the news that be as much physically active as possible. But when going to the workplace, it's a lot about, well, you should be cautious about this and that. You should not lift too much, and you should not do these type of movements. And I think it's not that strange that some of the particularly workers can be very confused about this and then not really know what to do. Let's go on with my slides. I will also refer to my mother, as I was done. This is a photo from our hometown in Lofoten, Norway, and it's not only because I would like to show you where I come from. It's also this is a picture of years, and it was quite easy to walk up on this mountain because they have made this staircase of solid rocks. And you can see it's all the way down from the road down here and the many hundreds of meters up this field up to the top, entire way up. And who did this? Yeah, it was these guys. And when I walked up here together with my mom, we're testing this nice staircase, and who has been doing it, and so forth. I said that, well, this must really be problematic. These rocks are really heavy, and it's a lot of them. So isn't that so that they will be injured or be very fatigued or have some problems? And then my mother said, no, it's great to be physically active. It's the best thing you can do. And these guys were interviewed by local media, and they said, this is just free exercise. So this is one of the jobs you can have. And then I was just fascinating. How can it be my mother said, how can it be that her approach to this would be so different from mine? And I think if we were in the audience, I would really like to ask the question, who of you think this is healthy for musculoskeletal health, for cardiovascular health, or mental health? Yeah. If we look at physical activity, I think the definition of physical activity is similar across all disciplines. It's defined as any body movement produced by skeletal muscles that require energy expenditure. And I think this is, I really believe this is the same concept we have about physical activity across disciplines. And I think we have a common ancestry about the marathon run came about. It's this soldier running from Marathon to Athens to warn the Greeks, warn the Greeks about military attack. At least this soldier was in principle paid for his job, so it was a worker. I think a marvelous performance, so almost like some kind of sport. And I actually think that he died afterwards. I think this shows that we have some kind of basic common ancestry. Look into research, we have some common ancestry. First, ethnological studies on physical activity and cardiovascular disease, at least the prospective ethnological observational studies, were done by Morris in bus drivers and bus conductors. The bus drivers sitting more than bus conductors, and Pfaffenberger doing the same type of investigations on the longshoremen. So those having a lot of manual labor, shipping on and off to the goods to the ships. This was all about work and effects of physical activity and of work and health. So this is we also have in common. But then I've been very intrigued about what happened then, because some years later, Professor Pfaffenberger and others moved from being focusing on the physical activity at work and manual labors and that health effects, and they moved to the more sedentary occupation groups and higher educational groups, like the Harvard alumni study. So that was mainly about the physical activity, like flights of stairs and how many city blocks you type and amount of sports. So the type of physical activity which the students were doing, and those being educated at Harvard, and that effect on future risk for mortality. And I found it so interesting how it changed so much, not only with respect to type of physical activity domain, but also about and well, it's most likely one of the reasons that both Morris and other colleagues, they believe that it's the sedentary work which is the problem. For that reason, we should not focus or research on doing manual work, but on those having sedentary work, and try to see how we can improve the physical activity for them and that population. And I think this is very intriguing, because I think it's fascinating that as a field like public health that very much have been focused on sedentary work and sedentary workers, which are often much higher educated and with much more privilege than those having manual work. And could this potentially actually increase this approach to physical activity? Could it actually increase the socioeconomic inequalities in health? And together with Leon Straker and other colleagues, we have, I think it's out today. It's an editorial in British Journal of Sports Medicine where we discuss this about, can it actually be so that the focus on these type of workers, these type of sedentary work, and that actually could increase the socioeconomic inequalities. Into one of the most recent physical activity guidelines from the US from 2018, it's fascinating to see that occupational physical activity, it's barely mentioned. And if you read the report, it states that most of the findings, some of these are based on studies of leisure time physical activity and not occupational physical activity. And I also think, like Peter mentioned, that I find this quite strange, because for many groups, and that's most often the low-educated, lower socioeconomic groups, it's work which is the main domain of physical activity. And I find it just intriguing how this can be possible. But in the end, I've also been faced a lot with the question about, in the bitter end, isn't it just about just move more and sit less? And why are you making so much a fuss about it? Don't you just make it the advice with respect to activity much more difficult and then harder to communicate with the public if you're saying that, well, some physical activity might actually not be as beneficial? And I think based on some of the most recent literature, like this brilliant study by Ulf Ekland and colleagues about accelerometry measurements of physical activity throughout the several days, often a week, and the association with mortality, you can see it's generally beneficial effects, which you can see both for total and LPA and MVPA, and you can see the opposites for sedentary behavior. But still, I think it's like everyone can see that, for instance, for MVPA, it's at least not linear. And I think for many workers, let's say some of the workers which we have worked a lot with is construction workers doing a lot of heavy manual labor. I think they up to much higher minutes of at least moderate physical activity than is on this scale. And you can see that is the confidence in so wide. So I think really good to be further disability according to work or leisure time. Yeah, just to follow up on what Peter mentioned, we have also done a study using activity-based data on physical activity and split it up in MVPA during work, MVPA during time, and done a compositional data analysis. I will not go into that. And here with the prospective outcome being long-term sickness absence, which is register-based. And here you can see when we are doing the isotemporal substitution with the compositional analytical approach, you can see that we have an increased risk for a higher amount of MVPA at work, while you can see it's the opposite for leisure time. So it seems like when we are having accelerometer-based measurements and health measure, like you can see same. Well, back to the difference. How can try to get very clear, and I've tried to do it here the best I could. How do the different disciplines of physical activity and from public health, sports medicine, occupational health, how would they approach different advices to fitness and health? I think the general advice currently is more physical activity, the better. And I think for sure that this is something from public health and leisure time physical activity completely agree upon. But when I ask my colleagues from occupational physical activity, most of those people say no. It's not necessarily so that it's more physical activity at work, the better. For sports medicine, I don't really know. It would be great to discuss with you. Another advice is much physical activity can be harmful. I think from a public health point of view, that's not much of an issue. For occupational health, for sure, we have a lot of legislation, regulations, a lot of recommendations for how to minimize heavy lifting, repetitive movements, strenuous work. So for sure, it's the perception that much physical activity can be harmful. Sports medicine, I really would like to have your opinion upon that. The advice to minimize sitting, I think it's completely opposite again from a public health and occupational health approach. That from public health, you should minimize it. For occupational health, I would say, I think many would say no. If you take a general occupation across over a lot of general occupational setting, that in many cases workers might be having too much, for instance, standing, and then it might be actually problematic to minimize sitting. Increase high-intensity vigorous physical activity. Again, I think it might be different between public health and occupational health. Lifting or heavy loads might be beneficial. I know this is something which we will be having more focused on in the WHO recommendation, which will be coming in November, Peter mentioned. And I think here, with respect to heavy lifting, I think it's a very different opinion and recommendation from public health and occupational health. I know about sports medicine in this respect, but I think this will also be an important topic of physical activity, which we need to discuss more and make some kind of better documentation and evidence across the disciplines. And then what I think also is important is with respect to recovery. Is recovery so important that it should be a part of the advice with respect to physical activity? I think at least now for public health approach, it's not mentioned. I don't think that's is perceived as being that important. For occupational health, it is for sure. For sports medicine, I've said yes, I believe so, but it would be good to have your input. But I think it's at least, of course, I try here to be very specific, perhaps a bit provocative, but how that it is so different between disciplines who have been doing research and practice with respect to physical activity and health for decades. And for both disciplines, if you ask them, no matter if it's with respect to mental health, physical health, general health, I think both disciplines will say, yes, the physical activity and the behaviors you do are important for health. So what can explain these type of differences between the disciplines? I think one of the main keys to this are that it's a very different focus of the purpose of physical activity between this. So for public health, I think the main purpose of physical activity is mainly be active during leisure time for well-being and health. For occupational physical activity, then the purpose of physical activity is not in principle mainly for well-being and health. It's for optimizing a work performance, be productive, do a productive work task without getting injured. That's in principle the purpose. if it's a manual work. And for sports medicine, I guess it is very similar to occupational physical activity field. Like it's about optimizing sports performance without injury. So it could both be for preventing injury to happen, but it could also be if you have an injury, you would like to fix the injury as best as possible for optimizing the performance, like we saw in the previous talk. So I think this might be a reason for why I think that the occupational physical activity discipline and sports medicine discipline have more in common with respect to advice and recommendations and practice than public health physical activity and for instance, occupational physical activity. I would like to hear your opinion upon that because I'm not sure. Another thing can be that it's a different focus on the important health outcomes. So I think for both occupational physical activity and sports medicine, musculoskeletal function, capacity, and health is among the top priority. We know that musculoskeletal health are, at least in Denmark, is the most important component for sickness absence, early retirement with huge costs. And I guess it's very much the same with respect to sports. That's one of the major causes for injury and for not performing or being able to exercise sufficiently is about not having the muscular function or capacity and health to perform very well. But with respect to public health, I find it quite fascinating that musculoskeletal function, capacity, and health is hardly mentioned, for instance, by WHO as an important outcome. So I think here it's more about mortality, it's more about cardiovascular disease, cancers, and mental health, which is also good, and I think really, really important outcomes. But I think the difference is really about the focus on musculoskeletal health, which I think is really important, and really hope that we can push this so it also becomes a top priority for WHO with respect to physical activity. And Peter mentioned it a bit, but I think it's worth to repeat that I think it's so important to be able to give evidence-based advice to different people. And I think that counts both from a public health authorities, occupational health service, or sports medicine. And nowadays, I think after many years, I think if you are if you have a worker having sedentary work, I think across these authorities or disciplines, they will come up very much with the same advice for a sedentary worker. So in general, it is if you are sitting a lot at work and you have to do it because you have several screens and perhaps you can stand, but you cannot move much, make sure that you have active transportation, are active, do sports during leisure time. I think that's very fine and that's simple enough. But here is where we have had almost all the focus with respect to public physical activity and health, at least related to the workplace. But which type of advice would you give to, for instance, these workers? So we've been out in manufacturing, like those working on different type of production lines, and we are measuring with estimators that some of them, they are doing static standing for about 7 hours at work. And it cannot be changed, at least not very easily, and certainly not by the worker themselves, because it's completely depending on the production line. So they are standing for 7 hours at work, and that cannot be changed. What do you think the recommendation should be? So from the public health authority, I guess think it would be that, well, they should be as active as possible, sit as little as possible when they are coming home from work. For occupational health service, I'm not sure, but I guess the current advice will be they should sit as much as possible when getting home because they need to rest and recover. Sports medicine, I'm not sure. Perhaps it would be more about trying to do exercises to improve fitness, but I would like to have your opinion on that. But in the end, I think the advice for these workers will be very different. What is to this type of jobs requires a lot of, have tons of those type of positions doing a lot of walking, not doing that much lifting any longer, but a lot of walking. We have studies from actimeter-based showing that, for instance, hospital cleaners, they are walking 15 to 20,000 steps per day, because that's necessary to fulfill the requirements with respect to what needs to be cleaned. But what should we really recommend to walk 15,000 steps at work? Should you then be recommended to sit, to be as much as active as possible, or do sports to improve your fitness of becoming fit for your job? I think these advices will depend solely and differ if you which one of these authorities or disciplines you will ask, which I think is a big problem. So we have together with colleagues, we tried to illustrate this in editorial in British Journal of Sports Medicine, illustrating it by how a day for a cleaner might look like, based on our accelerometer measurements on hundreds of cleaners. Looking that they drive to work, they are sedentary transport to work. At work, they are doing cleaning, so they are on their feet, walking, standing during the day, then sit for transport back home, and then have a very sedentary rest time. This is what looks like for a lot of cleaners, also other occupations of lower education and income. I think this activity advice would look at something like this. We would advise this person to cycle, at least do active transport, not change the behaviors at work, do active transport home from work, and then do running, walking, and perhaps a bit sitting when coming home. What would the occupational health advice be? There, I think it would be not change anything at leisure, neither before or after work, but we would advise to have some breaks in between. So with sitting, so you have some recovery and rest periods from the time on feet of walking during work. And as you can see, I think it's very different, the approach taken from the public health and occupational health respective advices. And just as a thought, what if we try to give some kind of integrated advice? How could that look like? And I think it might look like something like this, that you will recommend active transport, both before and after work. We recommend to have at least some rest and recovery time during work, so you're not on your feet for a long time. But then during leisure time, make sure that you both have sufficient amount of sitting for recovery, but also have some time for activities with higher intensities, so you get your fitness levels up, so you can be fit for work. So I guess this is just an illustration of how the current advice would look like from the different disciplines, and perhaps how we should try to work on it in the future, having it as an integrated advice. And I think one of the issues with why we are having, I would say, not non-optimal advice for different occupational groups, at least, based on, for instance, those sitting a lot, standing a lot, or being a lot on the feet, or lifting, like Peter mentioned. I think it's also a bit due to the dominating understanding we have today. So this figure is from the US physical activity guidelines, and I think it's one of the most tweeted figures from in 2018 or 19 or something like that, with respect to physical activity and health. It shows that the more you're sitting, the more you are in the red zone, which is unhealthy, and the higher level of moderate physical activity, you're in the green, healthy zone. Okay, so it's quite simple in principle. The more you're sitting, the worse health. The more you're moving, the better health. I think what this figure really illustrates is that, well, it's something missing. for instance, if you're looking into this corner, I think it's hardly ever anyone, or at least I don't know how they can achieve it, to sit a lot and at the same time also walk a lot. I think they must be having more hours during the day, or they must skip their sleep or whatever, because I think it's hard to do much of the one thing and much of the other without more hours during the day. Another thing is this corner, those never sitting and those not being active, what are they doing? Are they sleeping all the time, or what are they doing? So I think you know where I'm going at. I think it's something we need to change our basic understanding of physical activity and physical behaviors and health. But the same applies for occupational health setting. What has been, if you're asking a lot of ergonomists or other occupational physicians about occupational services, about what do we really know about physical activity demands and health, and I think at least those I've asked, they say something about the U shape. That, for instance, it could be for sitting, that never sitting, that's not good for health. Sitting all the time is neither good, but it's some kind of if you're sitting for some hours during work, for instance, that would be optimal. But of course, we can also say here that, well, if you are not sitting, then I think the health risk is not much about if you're sitting or not. It's more about what are you then doing? Are you doing heavy lifting? Are you standing? What are you doing? So I think in principle it is we cannot look at one single activity or just two single activities at a time. We need to have a more integrated approach, taking all domains and activities into account. So this is what I'm trying to say here, that I think we need to have some kind of 24/7 physical activity approach across the disciplines, which I mean that so it's not about the health effects from isolated behaviors. With that, I mean how much time you're using either sedentary with light physical activity or standing or in higher level activity, but it's the integrated of all behaviors during a day, during a week, during a month, which are of importance. And we cannot separate them into domains. We need to have all domains into account. Then I think it's important to,
I'm sorry, but can you wrap up, please? Because we're running out of time in our Friday lectures.
I'm wrapping up here. So if you are more interested in this, it's a webinar where I have on Thursday, which you can register at. We have a lot of top international researchers discussing this. And together with Peter and others, we have a NIVA course on this paradox next year. So please join us. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andreas. I'll look if there's a question. I was glad to learn that it all started at work. Maybe one final question from me. Now, the public health is totally worldwide involved in the COVID-19. Is there one element you learn from the public health approach worldwide or in Denmark that we can pick out to increase the attention to physical activity, to set it higher on the agenda?
Yeah, I think it's a lot. So I think it's been really great to see some of these information from this different type of devices showing that people when they are not at work are being more sedentary. I think that's really important piece of information, and I think it shows the importance of the environment and the structures. It's not only about motivation, but it's also about, for instance, going to work or not. And I know it's been a lot of discussions about because, for instance, in Copenhagen, it's normally to cycle to work. Then you are at work, you're cycling home, And it's been a lot of companies saying that they can see that the workers are becoming much more sedentary because they don't have this active transportation. So I think, and it will also be, I think it's also a lot about how to be able to promote physical activity when you're working from home, which is very different from the workplace. So I think it's so much to learn from this. It's also a brilliant type of experiment with respect to physical activity, changes in physical activity now.
Okay, thank you. And again, one of our students of Mario Mais with the final question to wrap up this Friday lecture. I don't know, is it a 5-pointer or a 10-pointer, Andreas, what they will receive? Do you think there are certain factors that cause people's health to be different between occupational physical activity and sports medicine?
So in principle, I think in respect to occupational physical activity, then I think it's very much about the primary focus. Then it's about, it's about doing a work tasks, which might be that you're required to stand for 7 hours, which most think that that's not good. But I think physical activity, so it's all about trying to optimize all the factors with respect to physical activity so it improves the performance of your work task. With respect to rehabilitation, I think it's more about, then we try to tailor all the factors with respect to physical activity so it improves the physical functioning and the performance of the person. So if you look into the characteristics of physical activity at those two disciplines, I think it will be almost the opposite, the complete opposite.
Thank you very much. Is it a 5-pointer, a 10-pointer question for you, Andreas?
Because I think it's really, it's at least a 4, perhaps 5.
Okay, I'll give that.